Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. A few more words for you today about Hávamál, or in modern Icelandic pronunciation, Hávamál. I have been thinking about reading, translating, teaching this poem for a quarter century, and I do not believe that any modern scholars accept the notion that this poem is originally composed as one unity from stanza 1 to stanza 164. Everyone agrees that this is stitched together out of earlier pieces. The exact details of what those pieces are, when they were originally composed, how and by who they were stitched together, etc. Plenty of disagreement there, but I don't think anyone accepts the notion that this is originally composed as one single thing. All right, that's the first thought. I was thinking, I've been teaching a class, reminds me a lot of the classes I used to teach at universities on Zoom to a wonderful group of students. And we've been reading Völuspá and Hávamál in the original languages. And I thought to myself at some point early in Hávamál, it really is striking how often the poet talks about not what a wise person does, but what an unwise person does. And I said, I bet that Hávamál mentions unwise people more than wise people. And so I set out to count this. And as I was counting the words for wise and unwise, I came to a thought that I thought was actually much more interesting than the count of wise versus unwise, which is the part of Hávamál that is most clearly separate from the rest of it, the part called Loddfáfnismál. This is stanzas 111 to 137, the part where Odin is addressing someone named Loddfáfnir, and then we have no idea who that is. In that part, he abruptly, completely stops talking about wise and unwise. The rest of the poem is chock full of it. There are tons of words that are used for wise in this poem. Let me show you what some of those are in an easy way while I'm sitting here at the computer. We have words like Orskar, which survives, for example, actually interestingly, as a borrowing into Finnish, in archaic Finnish, Horskas is wise in the same way. It means something different is used typically in Finnish today. There's Snotar, there's Froðr, there's Svinnar, which is related to Gothic Swinthas, or Swinths, strong. There's Snotar, there's Snjallar, ultimately related to German schnell, fast. Words for strong, fast, things like that often become words for smart. Right, he's quick on the uptake or whatever. These words are absolutely, they're just all over every part of Hávamál except Loddfáfnismál. And I was just kind of astonished with this, right? You can't throw a stick in Gestaþáttr, the first part of Hávamál. This, by the way, talking about the parts, I'm not necessarily making a claim about those being original unities either, or not being unities with other parts. These labels for regions of the Hávamál text are kind of agreed upon by scholars, regardless of those opinions about it. You can't throw a stick in Gestaþáttr without hitting something about somebody who's Snoter or Spinner or Horsker, right? And then there's the part right after that often called Jimmy Odin's, the part about love advice, about how men shouldn't trust women and women shouldn't trust men, and about Odin trying to seduce one woman and failing to seduce another. Also, just chock full of Horsker and Froðr and Snoter. And then you get to Runatal and Ljóðatal. So the part about runes and the part about Odin's magic spells toward the end. And once again, even though the content of that section isn't really about wisdom, right? It's not proverbial advice like Gestaþáttr is. We actually see those words quite a bit. Loddfáfnismál stands absolutely alone and using none of these words and not using any other adjective for wise or stupid or unwise either. I think that just about nails in the coffin that Loddfáfnismál is not part of it and not associated with the other parts of Hávamál originally. Now, there's other good evidence that Loddfáfnismál stands alone with respect to the rest of Hávamál. One of those lines of evidence is actually from linguistic dating. Now, not everybody thinks a lot about linguistic dating of texts, but I'm very interested in it. I've done a lot of independent research on this, and if you don't want to listen to a has-been on YouTube, there is also a tenured or tenure track faculty member at the University of Indiana who's published a whole book about this. Now, academic publishers being what they are, I think this book is like $350. The ebook is less, and that's what I've got. But Christopher Sapp also agrees Loddfáfnismál is much later than the rest of Hávamál. The rest of Hávamál, he and I agree, and I believe Leif Olsson's uh, work from the University of Bergen agrees. Most of Hávamál looks like it's composed in the 900s orally. Of course, the text that we have written down is from the 1200s. That's a different matter. Loddfáfnismál looks at least a century after that. It is linguistically later. It is not obsessed with words about wisdom and unwisdom the same way. So maybe this point has been made before elsewhere, but I think that the fact that Loddfáfnismál lacks archaic markers like the ov and particle, uh, which I sometimes call the Germanic augment, not to be confused with the Greek augment, which replaces the ga prefix that we see in the closely related language Gothic. Loddfáfnismál lacks that, which is abundant in the rest of Hávamál, and lacks words for wise and unwise, which are abundant in the rest of Hávamál. So, in looking for the ways that Odin calls us stupid in this poem, I realized that there was also a flashing red signal that part of this poem does not originally belong with the rest of it. Now, that is not me condemning Loddfáfnismál. Sometimes people hear that as a condemnation. The fact that it looks like this section was composed by, someone after the Christian conversion. It's not me throwing it in the waste bin. I have a lot of interest in this text, regardless of exactly when the parts of it were composed. But I think that it's important for knowledge to move forward, for us to acknowledge when we recognize that something that's been presented as a integral whole isn't. And that itself is pretty fascinating. And one might think exactly the kind of wisdom Odin would hang on a tree for. Bad segue toward the end there. All right, folks, if you are interested in reading Hávamál, let me tell you two places you can do that. I have translated it, and it is in uh, the second edition of my translation of the Poetic Edda. If you've seen the first edition, the one that's green with the aurora on it, this one is massively revised and expanded. It does not include the Old Norse text. If you want the Old Norse text, that is in the Wanderer's Hávamál together with my updated translation. Basically, in the second edition of the Poetic Edda, all the other poems are updated like the Wanderer's Hávamál is updated, the translation relative to the first edition Poetic Edda. The introduction in the second edition of the Poetic Edda is probably a little bit better. I, have 6 years more experience relative to the Wanderer's Hávamál in terms of um, research on dating poems, research on meter, that kind of thing. But again, if you want the Old Norse text and the commentary on it, that's in the Wanderer's Hávamál. And just to dispel a rumor for anybody else out there still listening to this, the Cowboy Hávamál is not the only translation I ever made. That is an incomplete translation of all of Hávamál. That's only the first part, Gestaþáttr, because it's the only part that made sense in a, you know, cowboy grandfather's voice, cowboy miner grandfather's voice. Uh, I do have an entire translation of Hávamál, which is in both of those books, and which reflects, again, a quarter century of working with this text with great interest and fascination and affection for it. All right. Thanks to those out there buying the books. Thanks to those out there supporting the channel on Patreon. And from beautiful Colorado, let me wish you all the best.